They found it by accident. A thin sheet of animal skin curled at the edges, layered under centuries of other papers in a palace that once commanded continents. When scholars in 1929 opened the archive doors at Topkapı in Istanbul, they lifted a fragment into the light, a world sketched on gazelle-skin, alive with sea creatures and angular coasts, a wind-rose geometry fanning out across the Atlantic like a compass rose caught mid-breath. The date on the face said 1513. The signature belonged to an Ottoman mariner who called himself Piri Reis, and the rumor almost immediately was that this map knew things it could not possibly know. It should be impossible. A chart of distant shores drawn when most ships still felt their way along the last line of known land. A document that seemed to reach across an ocean and grasp the rough edges of a new world, barely 2 decades after Columbus set his sails west. In the quiet of that archive room, the fragment looked like a secret someone tried to bury, or forgot, or erased. But the skin remembers. The inks remember. And the hand that placed those shorelines was neither a prophet nor a sorcerer. He was something rarer, a patient collector of other people's horizons. Piri was born along the Straits of Gallipoli in the late 15th century, where the sea breaks the land into nerves of wind and current. He sailed with his uncle, the corsair-turned-admiral Piri Reis, and learned the work of war and weather, the way the bow answers to a gust, the way a coastline reads like a sentence if you learn its grammar. The empire he served was ambitious and hungry, pressing its galleys out of the Aegean, arguing with Venice through cannon smoke, measuring wealth in hulls and ports. In that world, a map was a weapon. The man who signed the gazelle-skin in 1513 was not pretending to have seen the Atlantic's far side with his own eyes. He told us plainly, in notes scrawled on the parchment in Ottoman Turkish, what he had done. He had gathered maps, about 20 of them. He had taken 8 from the tradition of Ptolemy, with their ancient sense of balance and the allure of a southern land thought to steady the world. He had added 1 Arabic chart of India, 4 Portuguese maps of India and China, and, most tantalizing of all, a map he believed was drawn by Christopher Columbus of the western parts. Then he reduced them to 1 scale and let each line submit to a larger design. He was making a mirror from shards. He was building a coastline out of voices that did not agree. The fragment we hold is 1/3 of a larger whole. It shows the west coast of Africa in sawtooth fidelity, the Iberian margin turned toward the Atlantic like a calloused hand, the islands of the Caribbean scattered like broken terracotta, and the long eastern flank of South America running down the page. The windroses are points of command. Rum lines explode from them straight as arrows, stitching bearings across the sea. There are no neatly drawn meridians and parallels. This is not a mathematical grid of the world. It is a sailor's spell, a portolan chart. It was meant to move ships. Portolan charts were born in the Mediterranean and carry that sea's precision in their bones. They were built for dead reckoning, compass bearings, and distances sailed, plotted in straight lines from rows to rows. They are sharp near their cradle and blur at the edges. Stretch them over an ocean and the geometry fights the globe. Distortion creeps in with every league away from center. What they give in practice at small scales, they steal back in projection at large ones. And then there is the old, obstinate problem that ruled 1513 like a law of nature. Latitude could be taken from the sky. Longitude could not. You could know how high the sun climbed and how far you were from the equator. You could not know, with any reliable instrument, how far east or west you had drifted. Time was the missing tool. Without a clock that kept true time on a bucking deck, longitude at sea was a guess, often an act of faith. The prize that would be offered later for its solution was princely. The answer, John Harrison's Sea Watch in the mid-18th century, was still 2 centuries away. Any claim that a map from 1513 places coasts with consistent east-west precision is a story told backward. Yet when the fragment of gazelle-skin resurfaced, it did something undeniable. It revealed, in ink and pigment, a current of intelligence flowing through empires that did not share borders. Portuguese secrecy had tried to keep cartographic advantage inside the tight circle of crown and captain. Some of those lines bled outward anyway. In the Atlantic, we see Brazil's bulge with startling intimacy, a coast named and notched in a way that betrays pilots who lingered there and wrote their findings home. We see the distance between Africa and South America smoothed into something like the truth, as if Piri's hand could feel the wind on that run from the Canaries to Pernambuco. And still, the map misbehaves in ways that tell us exactly which century made it. The Caribbean is a beautiful confusion. Cuba is inflated and misconstrued, sutured in spirit to a mainland Columbus insisted was Asia. Hispaniola is prominent, familiar from Spanish obsession. There are islands that were dreamed into being by earlier mariners and linger on the skin like ghosts of rumors, names that belong to North Atlantic lore long before anyone reached the West Indies. Far down the page, an inscription tells of big snakes, the kind that thrive in tropical forests wandering too far south on this parchment, placed in a latitude where such bodies cannot live. North America, above the island scatter of the Caribbean, fades into generality and guesswork. Greenland does not appear at all in this surviving piece. It simply lies beyond the torn edge. This combination, the precise where pilots had walked, the fables where no soundings were taken, is the signature of the time. It makes the map human. It makes it credible. And it invites an error modern readers cannot resist, mistaking the places where projection distorts and sources collide for a glimpse of something impossible. The southernmost shape on the fragment is the crucible of the myth. It curves like a long, low continent, scalloped with bays and inlets, drifting toward the pole. For decades, it has been taken by some as Antarctica drawn centuries before its official discovery. Its coast, they say, matches the forms of Queen Maud Land. And if the match is true, then the ice must have been gone, the rock exposed, the world older than its textbooks. From there, the story leaps. Perhaps there were maps in a library that burned. Perhaps a civilization unsurveyed by history took the measure of every shore and whispered it forward under different names. Perhaps Piri copied a thread so ancient, the ice had yet to return. It is a seductive narrative. It is also a poor fit for the evidence. The southern object on the gazelle-skin has simpler and more stubborn explanations. It is the long southern reach of South America, torn from its axis by a projection never meant to hold the far south. It is a portolan's curvature turned into a cape. It is a collection of inconsistent reports forced into one sinuous form at a time when Patagonia had not yet been threaded by a European fleet. Magellan would find his strait only in 1520. In 1513, the area bled rumor and hope. And where data thinned, Piri turned to the old comfort of balance. Classical geographers had long imagined a great southern land, Terra Australis, to counterweigh the continents above. Cartographers inherited the instinct to fill the bottom of the world with coastline. The habit persists in this drawing. The silhouette at the page's base is a philosophical inheritance wearing a sailor's hat. Geology severs the last romantic tie. Antarctica's ice is not a thing of villages and centuries. It is a cathedral of millions of years. The great ice sheets began to lock down the continent in the deep past, tens of millions of years ago. Whatever softer interludes the climate allowed, there is no credible window in human history when a society could have paced out Queen Maud Land's naked stone and left a chart for Ottoman compilers to borrow. The southern line on Piri's skin is not a fossil of lost perfection. It is the residue of method, tradition, and the limits of a projection, stitched together on a table in an empire that wanted the world on a single page. That empire was remaking its boundaries in iron and ink. After 1517, when the Ottomans captured Egypt, Cairo's libraries and port papers lay within reach, and so did the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean beyond. Piri brought his map to Selim the Warnors at the height of this transformation, a visual argument that the Sultan's eye could roam from the Gulf of Guinea to the far side of the Atlantic. He would later compose his Book of the Sea, a manual of coasts and harbors, the Mediterranean written as a pilot's prayer and a bureaucrat's ledger. In 1525, he presented a refined version to the new sovereign, Suleiman the Magnificent, binding practice to prestige, and then, in old age, in a world already turning away from the drawn wisdom of his youth, he lost a battle near the mouth of the Persian Gulf and paid for it with his head in Cairo. His fall explains a silence. Documents attached to political failure are rarely cherished. They drift into the corners of great houses laid down in stacks that no one catalogues for generations. That is not a conspiracy. It is the biology of archives. The gazelle-skin endures anyway, and the notes along its edges point back to Columbus with a small, sharp certainty. The admiral of the Indies misread what he had seen. He worked hard to believe Cuba was part of Asia and to press the Caribbean into the margins of Kipangu and Cathay. In Piri's drawing, the confusion survives in the shapes and labels. It is an imported error, preserved like an insect in amber. That alone is priceless. Columbus's own charts of certain voyages are lost. Here, on an Ottoman surface, a slice of his misunderstanding remains. It is not a shadow of hidden knowledge. It is a reflection of a known mind in a known year. The more you stare at the fragment, the more the method reveals itself. The Portuguese coastlines hold their angles because their pilots kept private world atlases under lock and key, correcting them year after year, handing them to the next voyage like a sacred instrument. Some of those lines leaked, through commerce, capture, bribery, or simple human exchange, into other hands, Ottoman among them. The Arabic chart Piri mentions kept alive the geography of the Indian Ocean, its monsoon logic and trading harbors, the distances that had been counted for centuries long before the Portuguese rounded the Cape. The Ptolemaic inheritance supplied a frame, a philosophy of symmetry that gave weight where data was light. He reduced each to the same scale. As he said, that is not a trivial sentence. In an age before standard projections, forcing fragments from different traditions to obey one set of measures is an act of craftsmanship. It is also the root of several mistakes. If your sources are inconsistent and your projection indifferent to the globe, some seams will always show. Those seams are exactly where the legends prefer to settle. Look, they say, at the angle of a southern coast that seems to hint at the Rio de la Plata. Look at the bay that resembles another. Look at a curvature that implies the mouth of a strait undiscovered in 1513. But this is how the imagination backfills lack. We lay a modern map under the gazelle-skin until a curve matches enough to feel like proof. We forget that the fragment we hold is a third of a circle, torn from its companions. We forget that the south on a portolan is a place where lines become guesses and guesses become designs. The real astonishments are humbler and harder. 1. The Brazilian coast is articulated with names that tell a story of arrival and return, of pilots who dropped anchor and wrote, of state secrets that were only secret until a bribe or a friendship opened a chest. The Atlantic's breadth is shown not perfectly but faithfully enough to make the voyages work, that long reach from the islands of the east to the river mouths of the west. The Spanish obsession with certain islands marks the Caribbean as a theater, not a diagram. The animals painted into the margins and the legends about the people on particular coasts remind us that a map once carried ethnography and fear along with bearings and ports. There is also an absence, which becomes another kind of presence. The fragment does not show the eastern world at all. Asia and the Indian Ocean are somewhere to the right, beyond the tear. Europe and North Africa are cropped. Greenland and the Arctic vanish into the missing top. The blank edges are not an invitation to invent shocks. They are a reminder that we hold a piece of a larger argument, and that it is a mistake to ask a shard to resolve what only the whole once could. To follow the line of the story through the 16th century is to watch the map's status change. In the decades after 1513, cartographers like Diogo Ribeiro would refine the outlines with more data and different projections. The tools of long-distance navigation would remain blunt for a very long time, but they sharpened incrementally. The prize for solving longitude was announced in the early 18th century, a sovereign's plea for an answer to a problem that had sunk fleets. When Harrison's marine timekeeper finally kept the sky and the sea in sync, a new precision type entered the mapmaker's lexicon. The portolan style receded into the realm of art and history, and the globe could be carved by mathematics that obeyed invisible lines as easily as it traced visible coasts. Piri's fragment stayed where it had been slid in a palace that outlived empires, waiting for hands to pull it back into daylight. What remains, after the arguments fade, is the figure of a man who understood that power travels through information as surely as it travels in ships. He took the spoils of other men's landfalls and the weight of older worldviews and forced them to align until a sultan could look across an ocean he would never sail and feel it in his grasp. He had the mind of a compiler and the patience of a copyist. He also had the sailor's instinct for what matters most, a coast that can be followed, a bearing that can be held. None of that requires a myth of erasure to be meaningful. The map was not suppressed because it told the wrong truth. It was neglected because courts change, priorities shift, wars are lost, librarians die, and dust settles in palaces. The mystery is not that someone hid a forbidden secret. The mystery is how fast the world learned its own outline and how quickly that outline improved, given the crude instruments and the dangerous seas. There is one more truth in the parchment's quiet. Every claim that the fragment reveals an ice-free Antarctica or a pre-modern global survey is a wish for an easier story, a way to find certainty at the edges, a shortcut to awe. But awe is already there. It is in the rumb lines that still look like directions you could follow into the night. It is in the place names packed along Brazil's coast, each one a person, a ship, a day of sun and water now lost to language alone. It is in the stubborn admission of error preserved in the Caribbean's broken geometry, Columbus's hope for Asia smudged but visible. It is in the decision to write, I used these maps, and then to fit them, imperfectly, to one scale. Perhaps that is the cracked heart of the fragment's power. In a century of conquest, this is a document about listening, about hearing the world reported by enemies and strangers, ancients and neighbors, and letting those reports coexist on a single skin. The map's beauty is not that it knew too much. It is that it knew exactly what could be known and did not pretend to know more. The gazelle-skin in the Topkapı library is not a window onto a vanished super-civilization. It is a ledger of exchanges. Portuguese pilots sounded a coast and wrote. Arab sailors plotted harbors along monsoon winds. Classical geographers imagined the far south into existence to make the globe feel complete. An Ottoman admiral sat with all of it and made a thing the sea could use. The southern line that tempts the eye to Antarctica is a collage of distortions and inheritance, a human error that maps the limits of a method, not the shape of a hidden world. It is tempting to say, they erased this map. A phrase made for intrigue, for a thumbnail designed to catch a restless finger. But nothing essential was erased. What was lost were shelves and titles and context scattered by time's indifferent hand. What survived, pressed flat, is the story that mattered to the people who took risks on unforgiving water. Where the land is, where the islands lie, how far one coast sits from another, and how to make it back again. Stand with the fragment again. Your eye runs from the Canary Islands to Cape Verde, steps over the long, wet emptiness, and finds a mouth of a Brazilian river. You feel the logic in your body, the way the wind carries a hull, the comfort of a line of bearing drawn straight between roses, the relief of a coastline coming into view exactly where the drawing said it would. In that sensation is the answer to the whole riddle. Piri Reis did not draw the world to astonish us. He drew it so someone else could arrive. And that is the lasting revelation. The map is not an oracle, it is an instrument, not a prophecy, a practice. Its brilliance is the synthesis of imperfect parts into something that could steer a wooden ship through an ocean that killed indiscriminately. Its errors are the honest scars of its sources and its projection. Its allure is the glow of a moment when empires were carving roots into a larger reality, and a man at a table believed he could fit what was known onto one scale and leave the rest to be found. We want a different secret. We want the romance of a coast seen by eyes that no longer exist, a line carried forward like a smuggled truth. The gazelle-skin offers something subtler and more profound. It shows a world learning itself in stages, a chain of hands passing knowledge along a difficult path. It reminds us that the distance between ignorance and understanding can be crossed with a compass, a measured line, and the humility to write what you do not know in the margins and move on. What was erased was never the coast, it was the work behind the line. Here, in a leaf of parchment made from an animal that once ran across another continent, an admiral's careful compilation sets the record straight. Not a mystic, not a messenger from a lost age, a master of the possible, in a year when the possible was expanding like a new horizon. The map's final gift is the one we resist, wonder without myth. The kind that keeps you listening, keeps you patient, and keeps you traveling long after the ink has dried,